Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Karen Enriquez. I'm the SECO Area Agency on Aging Family Caregiver Support Program Care Coordinator. Today we'll be discussing understanding ambiguous loss. And I'm going to wait about another minute to begin. The term ambiguous loss was first used in the 1970s by Pauline Boss, a researcher who studied families of soldiers who went missing in action. During her research, Boss, who had previously used the term boundary ambiguity from 1973 to 1977, she changed that term and replaced it with the term ambiguous loss. Dr. Pauline Boss developed the concept of ambiguous losses, naming this as the most distressful of all losses. In relation to missing people, she identifies that a person is physically absent yet psychologically present. Therefore, the uncertainty and the lack of information about an absent loved one is traumatic. The loss is not verified. The natural human need for meaning, sense, security, knowledge, finality, and rituals are denied to the family. There is no closure or chance for resolution. People become preoccupied with thoughts about searching for the missing person. The resulting ambiguity freezes the grief process, often preventing one's ability to effectively process the situation emotionally, cope, or make decisions. Without information to clarify their loss, family members have no choice but to live with the paradox of absence and presence. Taken from Boss, 2006. Ambiguous loss is a loss that occurs without closure or clear understanding. This kind of loss leaves a person searching for answers and thus complicates and delays the process of grieving and often results in unresolved grief. Some examples are infertility, termination of a pregnancy, the disappearance of a family member, the death of an ex-spouse, or family member after being physically alive but in a state of cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's or dementia. An ambiguous loss can be categorized into two types: physical or psychological. Physical loss and psychological loss are different in terms of what's being grieved for: the loss of the physical body or the psychological mind. Physical loss means that the body of a loved one is no longer around, such as a missing person or unrecovered body from a war, but it is still remembered psychologically due to the chances of possibly coming back. A physical ambiguous loss can occur across generations, such as families of the victims of the Holocaust, and can cause traumatic disease and distress, such as post-traumatic distress disorder. The second type of ambiguous loss is where a person is still physically there, but is psychologically absent. This happens in cases where the brain is affected, therefore affecting the behavior and/or the well-being of the individual. Psychological ambiguous loss does not happen to just the family and friends of the person affected. Psychological loss can actually happen personally in terms of losing one's sense of who they are. This can stem from having a traumatic brain injury or not knowing who they are, causing a lost feeling and uncertain issues. As you can see from the slide, there's many different types. It can present itself in many different ways. Experiencing an ambiguous loss can lead to personal questions such as, am I still married to my missing spouse, or am I still a child to a parent who no longer remembers me? Since the grief process in an ambiguous loss is halted, it's harder to cope or move on to acceptance. There are various types of grief that can occur due to the type of ambiguity experienced and corresponding therapy techniques to address the certain types of grief. The overall goal of therapy to cope with ambiguous loss is to overcome the trauma associated with it and restoring resilience. In the end of a relationship that you really didn't understand, that elusive perfect career, or the city that you should have maybe moved to, a loved one that's gone missing but there's no resolution, a person you know changing through dementia or another disease, or just because you know people change and we don't understand why. All these things happen and we're not given the answer. We have no why, and we don't function well without the why. Loss is loss. How is ambiguous loss similar to traditional loss? Both of them create a loss within one's life, affecting their identity, their family relationships, their meaning and purpose, and their perspective. Both include a grieving journey that is never ending, and the emotions and the challenges are like a roller coaster. Both do not have a timeline for healing. Both have expected timelines from our culture, and both types of losses are individualized. They affect your belief systems, your perspectives, your routines, and your communication. Both have similar physical grief reactions, and there's no closure. Grieving process. The grieving process for an ambiguous loss differs from regular mourning in that one is unable to gain closure due to the unresolved grief. In cases of psychological ambiguous loss, the grieving process can be especially difficult because of the inability to accept or admit that there is a problem and that they cannot confront the situation in the first place in order to deal with the problem. Wikipedia defines 3 different types of grief. The difference between regular grief and grief from ambiguous loss is the type of loss creates the type of grief that becomes experienced. Grief in ambiguous loss can be both beneficial and difficult. Since the grief in an ambiguous loss differs from the linear stages of grief, there is no pressure to move on or to achieve closure. And this allows for people to remember the lost loved one and move on with relationships and life. There are 3 specific types of grief that can develop from the type of ambiguous loss. Anticipatory grief. It occurs before bereavement, mourning after death occurs and upon realizing that death may be imminent for a loved one. Anticipatory grief sets in. This type of grief is common among families who have a loved one living with Alzheimer's disease. The grief becomes anticipatory due to the knowledge that the loved one's mental state will only become worse. So the grieving process can actually start very early. Disenfranchised grief. The second type of grief that can develop from ambiguous loss is disenfranchised. It is also known as unrecognized grief because it often occurs in the loss of like a beloved pet or some type of grief that is not taken seriously. Frozen grief is the type of grief that is a result of the ambiguity of death because of the physical and or psychological disappearance. Therefore, one's grief is frozen since they don't get a chance to let it run a normal course. Ambiguous loss is a type of loss that happens when a person with dementia is physically present but at times psychologically absent. A caregiver may experience ongoing stress and grief due to ambiguous loss of having a loved one here but not present in the same way that they were before. It differs from experience of death because the loved one is still present. There is a lack of finality that typically occurs in death as a caregiver experiences the loss that is gradual. Our society generally does not give ambiguous loss the same weight as death because the person is still living and referring to what research has called disenfranchised grief. However, that ambiguous loss is still significant and detrimental. Caregivers are forced to continually grieve the loss of the person they once knew and loved while still providing care for them. Other research has found that caregivers may be preoccupied with how their loved one used to be, and when considering the present, they may determine that their loved one is another person. Caregivers experience several forms of ambiguous loss. It can be the loss of friends, which we all know caregiving leaves you little time to be with your friends. Staying in touch with them becomes harder and harder, and that contributes to loneliness. It can be the loss of your social life. You used to go to movies and concerts and plays. Now you feel lucky if you get to the grocery store. There's a loss of flexibility. The never-ending demands of caregiving can end flexibility. Doing things on the spur of the moment is rare, if not possible. And then the loss of dreams. Traveling, writing that novel, going back to school, keeping that job that you loved, it's all gone because you can't leave them. The loss of hope. Hope fades when your dreams are cast aside. It's hard to be enthusiastic about caregiving without hope. You may struggle to keep your hope alive as your loved one's health deteriorates. Loss of self. Your identity as a daughter, wife, son, husband are replaced with the role of a caregiver. The ambiguity of having a loved one who is lost only partially leads to anxiety, ongoing strain, and confusion. Identifying this ambiguous loss can help caregivers see that they're not going crazy. It's the entire situation that's crazy. It is considered problematic when a caregiver puts decisions on hold, other family members' needs are not being attended to, your daily tasks are not getting done, or if the psychological pain from the loss goes unresolved and untreated. Now think about what we're all going through right now, living with COVID-19. We have lost our lives as they were, and we know it won't last forever, but it feels that way. We know things will forever be changed, but we don't quite know how. We have lost what we consider to be a normal, a loss that is certainly unclear. As with dementia, until there is a cure, and with coronavirus, until there is a vaccine, there is no predictable ending, leaving us feeling uncomfortable, uneasy, and grieving. Lack of control and predictability. The virus is spreading. Our community is closed. When will life get back to normal? We have losses of sources of support. Social isolation due to physical distancing and sheltering in place has caused changes in sources that we may have used in the past. perception that things are getting worse. We hear the news, we listen to the reports. Will we ever recover? Feelings of not having what it takes to meet the next obstacle. Helplessness and fears about what is happening if you get sick and who will be able to provide the care for those people that need it. One key factor in getting over ambiguous loss is resilience. In normal grieving, in the normal process, people obtain closure by dealing with that loss. In ambiguous loss, closure does not exist. How can we learn to live successfully with such uncertainty? In her book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, Pauline Boss, PhD, provides guidelines to help us become more comfortable with living with ambiguity. Finding meaning means making sense out of the situation. When a situation is ambiguous, it's hard to do, but it is essential to minimize our feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. When we can't change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Finding meaning in a tough situation is the key toward accepting that there are situations outside of our control. Balance control with acceptance. When we can't control what life brings us, such as dementia or living through a pandemic, we can choose how we react. When we can't fix or solve the problem, we can decide to be okay with living with the uncertainty. We can make a conscious decision to be fine with unanswered questions or problems that can't be solved. They are out of our control, but if you balance that control with acceptance, you can decide what to control, such as taking care of yourself while you take care of another, or by asking for help. We practice social distancing and hand washing. This allows us to embrace the uncertainty and decide not to let it terrorize us. Ambivalence. It's normal to have mixed feelings such as fear, anxiety, anger, strain, and tension when it comes to grieving. Manage those feelings by acknowledging your sadness as it comes and grieve when you need to. Don't keep those feelings to yourself. Share them with supportive friends, family, support groups, or a healthcare provider. Imagine new hopes and dreams. As we continue to feel the uncertainty and the ambiguity of caregiving and the pandemic, we may want to think about what we hope for. When a person is psychologically changed due to dementia, we need to modify our hopes and dreams of how to stay connected to them as they are now, instead of longing for who they used to be. With the pandemic, it's important to remind ourselves that this is temporary and to identify our mixed feelings as grief. Naming it and accepting it gives us permission to feel it. Open your thoughts to a realistic future hopes and dreams and focus your mind on those goals. Self-care. This is the time to be mindful of your own self-care. Everything is happening. It's real. We can deal with it. Engage in activities, exercise, hobbies, taking breaks, connecting with supportive friends and family, now through virtual means, and identify ways to calm yourself. Ambiguous loss touches all of us at some time. As with caregiving and living through COVID-19, life will return to some type of normalcy. It has been suggested that the new normal will look more like an adopted version of normalcy instead of the way it used to be. Situations such as these provide us with opportunities to accommodate, to grow, and to recognize our resilience. Do the best you can, and that's good enough. Allow yourself to feel your feelings as you feel them. And for now, just know we're all in this uncertainty together, and that is the one thing we can be certain about. Your SEGO Area Agency on Aging is concerned about the impact of the COVID-19 on older adults in Cochise, Graham, Greenlee, and Santa Cruz counties. We are available to you daily. We closely monitor the news and all of the available resources from the Centers on Disease Control, the directive from the Administration on Community Living, and the Arizona Department of Economic Security. Please visit us on Facebook at Southern Arizona Area Agency on Aging and our website at sego.org. I am available to you with any questions. You may contact me at 520-432-2528, extension 221, or at Enriquez@sego.org. And remember, together but apart, we are here to serve you. Thank you.